Someone's shooting at something over there. There's a lot of artillery fire over there. There is a very, very intense artillery battle going on around Bakhmut today. Finally, Vladimir Putin was able to declare victory in Bakhmut, but it may yet prove a hollow one.
20 мая 23 года, 20.05.2023. Сегодня пополудня в 12 часов.
By the end of April, the Ukrainians held only a few apartment buildings at the top of the slope on the very western edge of town, and it looked like defeat was inevitable. Until on May the 9th, the unthinkable happened. Suddenly, backed by a massive artillery barrage, Ukrainian infantry and tanks assaulted the Russian flanks to the north and south of the town. In a matter of hours, they'd retaken hundreds of meters, in some places over a kilometer, that it had taken months for the Russians to capture. It was a reversal so unexpected that it shocked some Ukrainians as much as the Russians. But inside the city, Wagner continued to advance. Within days, the roads had been cleared, the remaining Ukrainians were able to withdraw, and that meant that the Russians could advance. It took Russia 9 months to capture Bakhmut. His account, I asked him to sum up the situation in a couple of words, and he said, stably f***. When the war broke out in February last year, Bakhmut was not on the front line, but it was a pretty important Ukrainian staging post because you had several front lines within about 20 miles of there. At the beginning of this battle, and actually quite a long way into it, the Ukrainians were quite puzzled about why the Russians were so obsessed with this place. It is a fairly big town, as Donetsk region towns go. If you want to conquer Donetsk region, it is, I suppose, a logical place to start because it's one of the main towns that's still under Ukrainian control. But it's not a strategic linchpin. It doesn't control some kind of gateway that's going to cause a Ukrainian collapse. And yet the Russians kept on sending troops towards it, even though they weren't making much progress. Bakhmut was playing quite an important kind of logistical role for the Ukrainians when the Battle of Donbass began in the spring of 2022. August 1st is generally thought of as the beginning of the Battle of Bakhmut. The Russians managed to approach the eastern outskirts of the city, but they got held up there. They tried to get across the Bakhmutska River, that's the river of the same name it's on, south of the town, but they got held up there. And so the Russians, quite sensibly, tried to go around the side. You essentially had a battlefront which was much bigger than Bakhmut itself. We're talking about a battlefield that really stretched about 16 miles, 8 miles either side of the city itself. And of course, the offensive was, from the beginning, led by Wagner, the mercenary company led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. So a lot of people were speculating, well, maybe these guys are being paid per meter taken. But as the battle went on, as it absorbed more and more men and more effort from both sides, Bakhmut took on a totemic status really far in excess of its actual strategic value. It's quite clear that this battle isn't really about Bakhmut itself. This battle is about bleeding the other side. By autumn, this has become First World War style battle of attrition. It's already drawing comparisons with the Battle of Verdun. The lines are basically static. The Russians are on the edge of the city, but they can't really get in. Sometimes they take some ground, the Ukrainians push them back. Both sides are hurling artillery around. And inside the city, things are just getting destroyed. This is the time the Telegraph was able to access Bakhmut. We had to wait until quite bad weather, so low cloud, because that's when drones can't really fly. You're a bit safer from artillery. The situation was already absolutely dire. I mean, no running water, no electricity, no heating. The civilians who were there were basically trying to survive in basements. Some of them were still stubbornly staying in their flats in high-rise apartment blocks. This was about the time that the Russians started a general campaign across the country of targeting energy infrastructure because they were trying to freeze the country into submission. This was already an urban battle, quite a brutal urban battle, in which, I mean, there is no way the Russians didn't know there were still civilians in the town. At the very end of December, they seem to have made a decision. We're just going to try and go around the side. So on December 27th, they began a very big assault suddenly on Soledar, not on Bakhmut itself, on the other satellite town about 8 miles up the road. That battle lasted about 2 weeks. It was incredibly bloody. It was led by the Wagner military group, and the way they took it is basically with human raid attacks. So they were getting guys recruited from prison, quite poorly trained. They were basically treated as cannon fodder, saying, if you retreat, we're going to kill you anyway. So your only chance of survival is to charge at the Ukrainian lines, hope you get there. If you talk to Ukrainian soldiers who fought in Soledar, they talk about, firing their rifles until they're too hot to handle, running short of ammunition because they've killed so many guys, but there's still guys coming at you. When you run out of ammo, you're in trouble. And over time, despite the massive casualties the Russians took in the Battle of Soledar, they managed to inch forward. And by the middle of the month, the Ukrainians have admitted that they've abandoned that town. Now, on its own, losing Soledar might not have been fatal for Bakhmut. But at around about the same time, there was another offensive on the southern side of that long front line. And they pushed up, again, not at Bakhmut itself, but they were heading towards the main highway behind it, the highway connecting Bakhmut with a town called Konstantinovka. That was the main supply line for the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians managed to stop that offensive, but only within about 1 kilometer or 2 of the road. And they pushed them back a little bit, but not that far. So that road was suddenly under fire, under direct fire. It was now at the point where, Ukrainian drivers were saying, yeah, you can still drive that road, but you've got to go at maximum speed the whole way. By the end of January, the Ukrainians have pushed back the attempt to cut the Konstantinovka road, but the Konstantinovka road is now under fire. The Chasiv Yar road is under artillery fire. And it's pretty clear the Ukrainian position is much, much more precarious. That's when I and Julian Simmons, the Telegraph photographer, showed up in the area. And I must say the atmosphere, the kind of rumors flying around amongst soldiers and volunteers and civilians and so on was all kind of pointed towards this sense that we're going to have to give up the city sometime soon. The atmosphere is really, really quite tense. I've just spoken to the mayor, his account. I asked him to sum up the situation in a couple of words, and he said, stably It was getting too vulnerable. It was just getting too precarious. The last thing they want is to have an army surrounded and then slowly destroyed. That would be a massive disaster, not only because you lose a bunch of guys, but just the impact on morale would be catastrophic. Early February, I'm standing there in Chasiv Yar, a few miles from Bakhmut, listening to the artillery battle, watching the helicopters very close by come up, fire their rockets, trying to hold back that attempt to cut that road, thinking this is not going to last long. Like, the Ukrainians are going to have to pull back. I've seen a few retreats in my time. You kind of get this sense about when an army is going to have to pull back, and I thought I was feeling it then, but they held on. Early March, you've got Yevgeny Prigozhin of Wagner is standing on top of a rooftop in Bakhmut claiming that he's basically surrounded the place, claiming that if Zelensky doesn't order these Ukrainian troops to surrender, that they're all doomed.
Фактически окружен.
I mean, as the battle wore on, it became to have almost more totemic political value than it did strategic value. Like, Yevgeny Prigozhin viewed it not so much, or not only as a battle against the Ukrainians, but also as a battle against the Russian Ministry of Defense. And there were certain points where it almost looked like he was more concerned about putting one over on Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, or Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, than he was about defeating the Ukrainians. I mean, during the Battle of Soledar, he began putting out a remarkable series of press releases talking about how the army had nothing to do with this, how this was all PMC Wagner. Towards the end of the battle, he was saying that his representatives had been frozen out of planning meetings. So Bakhmut is going to go down in history not just as a battle between the Ukrainians and the Russians, but it's also going to become emblematic of this massive problem the Russians have got, which is this lack of unity of command, the way that individual rival fiefdoms, we used to call them towers of the Kremlin, rival towers of the Kremlin, are pulling in different directions. And that, I think, in the long term, may prove the downfall, or one of the downfalls, of the Russian war effort. So the fall of Bakhmut is not actually a massive strategic blow. Behind it, there is a really formidable highland, these quite high hills, this network of valleys, and the Ukrainians have been digging in and preparing extra lines there for months. It's basically a fortress. So all the Russians have done is, okay, they've captured Bakhmut. Now they've got their next natural fortress. They're going to have to slog through if they want to try and get into the next valley, which is where the real prize is, the city of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and Druzhkivka and Konstantinovka. Bakhmut was certainly the longest battle of this war. It's longer than most battles in World War I. It's certainly the longest battle for a single city that Russia or Ukraine has fought since the Second World War. Now it's over. Is it really going to change the course of the war? I think it's one of those battles where the results are going to show up for months and years to come, and not necessarily around Bakhmut. The results of this are about attrition. It's about how many men were lost, how much ammunition was lost, how many resources were poured into that battle by both sides that could have been better used elsewhere. The war of movement is likely to resume elsewhere on the front, but when historians write the history of the war in Ukraine, Bakhmut will be a very important chapter.